Hello, I'm Roxanne, and today I would like to present my final paper, which is titled Language and Identity, Reimagining Education as a Linguistic and Cultural Space for Everyone. This presentation will look briefly at the introduction, the whys of the importance of this paper, language and identity, identity narratives, / linguistic assimilation, reconstructing identities, negotiating linguistic identities, translanguaging, and conclusion. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe once said, "He who knows no foreign languages knows nothing of his own." As human beings who are social by nature, belonging to groups that share cultural norms, language is key for interpersonal communicative skills that are necessary to express group membership. Now, language gives us many choices. We can identify with whoever we want to. We can belong to different ranges of groups. And if we look through the lens of the International Baccalaureate philosophy when concerning language, the role of language in identity affirmation is of particular significance as a pedagogical principle. Well, as an educator working both in IB schools in Spain and in the United States, where I have been teaching additional languages, that's IB Talk for languages that are not our students' first language or their L1. I find it important to address and promote group cohesion and inclusion within our classroom. Through teaching experience in diverse linguistic settings, I've been able to observe how the role of language and how students perceive themselves in relation to others in various contexts is important in determining whether the social outcome is positive or not. My research paper will explore different identity narratives, translanguaging, international education, as well as reflect on strategy that 21st century educators could implement to improve diverse linguistic learning environments that are cohesive and inclusive of different language learnings. Now, my intention is to address a larger issue that academic success and the ability to reflect critically on all aspects of identity is essential, especially when negotiating power and status in relationships. Gloria Anzaldúa once said, "I write to record what others erase when I speak, to rewrite the stories others have miswritten about me, about you." I think this quote fits perfectly when we need to talk about language and identity. We cannot talk about language without talking about identity, and we cannot teach a language without considering identities. Now, identity, as we've seen in different topics, and as well as I've seen in researching this paper, identity can be imposed upon, can be assumed or negotiated. And with that said, it's important that educators create a positive learning climate. And sadly, we can take a look at the United States, where I'm originally from, and we can see that this has not always been the case. Looking back, examining language and education in the United States, despite the country's rich, diverse linguistic and cultural landscape, quick assimilation into English has been a major characteristic of the country's history. As we can examine, using the United States as an example, questions of power, race, and ethnicity are tied into the debate of bilingual and multilingual education. And in this debate, oftentimes, instead of focusing on the betterment of democratic institutions and the role of education as the quote-unquote great equalizer, the main focus is obscured with questions of U.S. American loyalty and assimilation. To understand this debate, I had to deeply reflect on my own background, my own identity, and how it was influenced by historic events which shaped my family's upbringing and their selfhood. Growing up in the 1960s in Los Angeles, California, my mother, a second-generation citizen in the United States, grew up mostly speaking Spanish. Although her level of English, which she learned at school, was native-like, teachers put every single student with a Spanish surname, regardless if they spoke flawless English. They put them in remedial classes. These classes, which my mother expressed, didn't cover much content, and the result of this pull-out method in the 1950s and 60s created a large gap of learning opportunities. This strategy, which did not promote inclusive learning, was an example of segregation, a way to separate Spanish speakers, an ethnic group, with others. These types of classes were a great disservice to students who were falling behind in their core classes. And some may even argue with statistics that it caused students to drop out of high school. Flashing forward to the 1980s when I was born, my mother, based on her misconceptions of being bilingual, or multilingual, which she viewed as a handicap, she raised my brother and I in a strict English-only household. I remember in elementary school, there was, ironically, coincidentally, a time when I was also taken out of quote-unquote normal classes, and with all my other classmates who had a Spanish surname, we were put in ESL classes, English as a Second Language. And I remember being excited because it was an opportunity for me to learn Spanish, and I was picking it up quite fast. But when my mother caught on to this pull-out method, she put her foot down and she spoke with the teacher, who tried to persuade her that these types of classes would be beneficial for me to learn Spanish and also for my classmates to learn English from me. But my mother was not having that. And I do remember that my classmates in ESL, once I was taken out, thought I was a snob for not being with them. Now, if we see that a person's culture is tied with their native language or the language of their ancestors, learning about who I was through Spanish for the early years of my life was being blocked due to my family's experience of what they lived in. Instead of my mother embracing her bilingual roots being from the United States and having roots in Mexico, being of dual cultures, my mother linguistically shed a layer of her identity and attempted to do the same for myself and my brother. As I grew up as a teenager and went off to college, I began first by learning Spanish on my own. I began my quest reconstructing my identity of what it meant to be a U.S.-born woman of Cuban and Chicana roots. And I did this, apart from learning Spanish, I did it also by exploring different writers who wrote about dysphoria and linguistic borderlands. I've come to realize that as much as I look like my ancestors, I don't sound like them, and I have what people call a gringa accent. Well, at the same time, no matter how great my English may sound, sometimes my ideas, that what I want to convey, sometimes they don't sound as eloquent to a quote-unquote Anglo-Saxon speaker. The idea of living life on the borderlands, especially linguistic borderlands, rings true for me, being in between worlds, between languages and cultures. And I came across this beautiful poem by Gustavo Pérez Firmat and another one called Bilingual Blues that shows the struggles of living life biculturally and bilingually. And sometimes these situations can be awkward, and sometimes words can fail a person bilingually or multilingually in either language. Now, as an educator living abroad in Spain, where I work teaching English as an additional language at an IB school, I often reflect on how to be an effective teacher in diverse settings where many of my students only hear and explore English as a language in the classroom context. While researching for this paper, I've paid attention to learners at my school who at home speak Mandarin Chinese and at school are put into English and Spanish learning environments. And although there is no traumatic situations like my mother endured in her formal education, I wonder how these students at my school, what identity they're being negotiated on, and how I as an educator can help foster their identity while at the same time teach them another language. Recently, translanguaging has become a popular term in the IB community. It is encouraged and embraced by educators as it encourages learners to have empathy and tolerance with each other. Now, this is a big, heavy-loaded term. According to Ofelia Garcia, who is a graduate professor in CUNY, she describes translanguaging as the process whereby multilingual speakers utilize their languages as an integrated communication system. Now, we know in our master's program in IB, a perfect IB student creates the best learning experiences are when students create meaning to their learning. Educators need to acknowledge this phenomenon that occurs in students who speak and learn multiple languages, and we need to allow them to use their linguistic tools and pull out that they have from their linguistic repertoire in order to build upon additional languages and use them. Steps that we can take to make a classroom translanguaging friendly is by having a variety of different books and multimedia in different languages, having the classroom labeled in different languages, teachers being flexible and allowing time for students to reflect in their language, and also being able to participate in learning engagements in the language that they choose. Along with the classroom is also creating an environment in which the learners are able to teach key expressions in their language. It's also important to acknowledge that this idea of translanguaging is not just for the student who has recently arrived or migrated from another country. It's also for the child who is already bilingual or multilingual, as they need to understand that they don't have to separate two or more identities, but instead they have a multifaceted identity. Now, the beauty of multilingualism lies in the ability to express ourselves in multiple ways. As educators, we don't know what our future will look like, what kind of society or workforce our students will grow up into. But what we do know is that students, in order to succeed both academically, socially, and as a whole, they will have to think critically, make connections, communicate clearly, and most importantly, they need to know who they are, world citizens with multifaceted identities. Now, I'd like to thank you for your time and for letting me share and reflect. Thank you.